What would you do if a single act of kindness could change your life? In the heart of a bustling city, on a rainy day, a man named Tom walks into a diner with nothing but his infant daughter and a desperate hope for a fresh start. He's met with cold stares and hesitation, until one brave woman decides to take a chance on him. But can one small gesture of kindness spark a ripple that changes everything? The gray sky loomed over the city, casting a dreary pall over the streets as a steady drizzle tapped against the windows of John's diner. Inside, warmth enveloped the small, cozy space, mingling with the scents of coffee, freshly baked pie, and sizzling bacon. The diner was a beloved neighborhood spot where regulars greeted each other by name, and conversations buzzed softly over the clinking of cutlery. Behind the counter, John, the diner's owner, wiped a coffee cup with a white dish towel, his gaze drifting occasionally to the round clock on the wall. His thoughts ran ahead to the afternoon rush, already planning out the timing of the grill, the rotation of his staff. John thrived on routine and predictability, a man who preferred his days like his diner, neat, organized, and calm. Today, however, was not going to follow any plan. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The man hesitated, lingering in the doorway as if uncertain of his welcome. He was soaked from the rain, his clothes ragged and clinging to his frame. In his arms, he cradled a small child wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Instantly, the lively chatter within the diner softened to a murmur. Heads turned toward the door, and eyes lifted from newspapers and smartphones. The man's presence was like a stone thrown into a pond, sending ripples of discomfort through the room. John noticed the shift immediately. His hand paused mid-wipe, and he set the cup down, frowning. He wasn't a cruel man, but he had a business to run, and he feared what an uninvited guest like this might mean for his paying customers. Wiping his hands on his apron, John walked over, keeping his voice low but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, stopping a few feet away. "I'm sorry, but I can't have you staying in here. I've got a business to run," and the man lifted his head, and John saw his eyes, dark, hollow, and lined with fatigue. He glanced down at the baby in his arms, then back up at John, as though searching for a way to explain himself. But before he could speak, a voice from the back of the diner cut through the tense silence. "Wait just a moment," the voice called out, clear and commanding. "Let him stay." All eyes turned to the source. A woman in a dark blue business suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, sat with a calm but determined expression. Her gaze was fixed on John, and there was no mistaking the resolve in her eyes. John hesitated, surprised by her interruption. He wasn't used to people challenging his authority in his own diner. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," he began, his tone softening slightly, "but I have to think about my customers." "If I let him stay, I'll pay for whatever he needs," she interrupted firmly. "Just let him sit down, John. Please." For a moment, John considered arguing further, but something in her voice gave him pause. He glanced at the man by the door, then back at the woman. The whole diner seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what he would decide. "Fine," John muttered, sighing. "But he sits in the corner, and he doesn't bother anyone." He pointed to an empty booth by the window. "Over there." The man nodded quickly, murmuring a quiet thank you, and shuffled over to the booth, moving with a careful, almost deliberate quietness, as if trying not to draw more attention. The woman stood up and walked over to the booth, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum. She sat down across from him, offering a gentle smile. "Hi," she said, her voice much softer now. "I'm Laura." "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then answered quietly, "Tom." "And this is Lily." Laura nodded, her gaze shifting to the child in his arms. "She's beautiful," she said. "How old is she?" Tom looked down at his daughter, his face softening. 8 months, he replied, almost as if he needed to remind himself. "We've had a rough time lately." Laura leaned back slightly, sensing his discomfort. "I'm not here to pry," she assured him. "But if you need help, I'd like to try." "Are you from around here?" Tom shook his head. No, he said slowly. We came here looking for a fresh start. But things didn't go as planned. I lost my job, and then, we lost our home. Laura's face softened. That's tough, she said quietly. Especially with a little one. I can't imagine how hard it's been. Tom nodded, his eyes downcast. I just want her to be safe, he murmured. To have a chance at something better. I'm doing my best, but... John returned with a bowl of soup and set it down in front of Tom. On the house, he said gruffly, though his expression was less stern now. But just this once. Tom blinked, clearly surprised. Thank you, he whispered, his voice catching slightly. Laura looked up at John. Thank you, John, she echoed, her tone warm and sincere. John grunted, but his gaze lingered on Tom for a moment longer before he turned back to the counter. Just don't make me regret it, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Tom picked up the spoon with a trembling hand and took a sip of the soup. The warmth spread through him, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in his chest. He glanced up at Laura, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice stronger now. Laura shrugged, a small smile touching her lips. Because I can, she said simply. And because we all need a little help sometimes. Tom nodded slowly, taking another sip of the soup. Around them, the noise of the diner began to rise again, conversations and clinking dishes filling the space. But something had shifted, a subtle change, like a new note in an old song. At a nearby table, an older man named Mike, who had been quietly observing, turned to the waitress, Sophie. Put another bowl of soup on my tab for him, he said, nodding toward Tom. Sophie nodded and gave Laura a small, encouraging smile before heading to the kitchen. Laura returned the smile and turned back to Tom. We'll figure something out, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. One step at a time. Tom looked at her, a hint of hope brightening his tired eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest glimmer of a path forward. The diner gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy had shifted. Conversations resumed, but now with an undercurrent of curiosity. Eyes continued to drift toward the corner booth, where Tom sat with Laura, trying to make sense of the unfolding story. Tom focused on the bowl of soup in front of him, savoring each bite as if it were a rare delicacy. It was more than just food, it was a moment of warmth, a brief reprieve from the cold world outside. His hands still trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the overwhelming mix of relief and uncertainty that filled him. Across from him, Laura studied his face carefully. She could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the wary way his eyes darted around the room, as if expecting trouble at any moment. She noticed the way he held Lily, his arms wrapped around her protectively, even as she slept soundly. After a moment, Laura broke the silence. Tom, she began softly, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of work did you do before all this? Tom paused, the spoon hovering over the bowl. He glanced at Laura, weighing whether to trust her. But there was something in her expression, an openness, a sincerity, that made him feel like he could take a chance. I was an accountant, he said quietly, setting the spoon down. I worked for a small firm out west. Things were good, until they weren't. The company went under, and I didn't have anywhere to go. I thought a fresh start here might help, but without an address, without a way to clean up, it's been harder than I ever imagined. Laura nodded thoughtfully. I understand, she replied gently. It's a tough cycle to break. But you have skills, Tom. Experience. That counts for something. Tom gave a small, half-hearted smile. It hasn't counted for much so far, he muttered. Laura leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. Listen, she said carefully, I run a small marketing agency downtown. It's not a big operation, but we're always looking for someone good with numbers, someone who can handle budgets and finances. Tom's eyes widened slightly, unsure where she was going with this. Are you offering me a job? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Laura smiled warmly. "I'm offering you a chance," she replied. "Come by tomorrow, meet my team. Let's see what you can do. No promises, but it's a start. What do you have to lose?" Tom blinked, trying to process her offer. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Laura shrugged lightly. "I believe in second chances," she said simply. "And I've got a feeling you're worth it." Tom looked down at Lily, still sleeping in his arms, then back at Laura. His expression softened, a mix of hope and gratitude flickering to life. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Laura grinned, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "You can start by showing up on time," she teased gently. 9 o'clock sharp. I'll have coffee ready." Tom nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time in months. He felt a tiny spark of hope ignite inside him, like a match in the darkness. As they talked, Sophie, the young waitress, approached their table with a basket of bread and a small jug of milk. "Thought you could use a little extra," she said to Tom, her smile bright. Tom looked up, surprised by yet another kindness. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to do that." Sophie shrugged, her smile widening. "Hey, we all need a break sometimes. Besides, it's just bread and milk. Enjoy." She turned to walk away but glanced back at Laura, sharing a knowing smile. Tom watched Sophie return to the counter and then turned back to Laura. "Do you know her?" he asked, genuinely curious. Laura shook her head. "Not really," she replied. "Just another kind soul, I suppose." Tom nodded, trying to make sense of it all. The warmth of the soup, the bread, the milk, these simple acts of kindness felt like a lifeline in a sea of hardship. He had prepared himself for rejection, for being turned away once again. And yet, here he was, with a chance at a new start. "So," Laura said, breaking the reflective silence, "tell me about Lily. She seems like a sweet baby." Tom smiled, a genuine smile this time. "She's everything," he said simply, his voice full of love as he looked down at his daughter. "She's what keeps me going, even when things get hard." Laura nodded, a soft understanding in her eyes. "She's lucky to have you," she said gently. "It takes a lot of strength to do what you're doing." Tom's gaze met hers, and for a moment, he seemed almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I don't feel very strong," he admitted. "Most days, I'm just trying to survive." Laura leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Sometimes, just surviving is the strongest thing you can do," she said quietly. "And you've already proven you can do that. Now it's time to start living again." Tom swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. "I'd like that," he murmured. "I'd really like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the air between them filled with an unspoken understanding. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, the diner felt warm and safe. The door opened again, a gust of cold air sweeping through. A few customers turned to see who it was, but when they realized it was just another passerby, they quickly returned to their conversations. John glanced over from the counter, his expression still wary but slightly softer. He walked back over to Laura and Tom's table, his hands on his hips. "All right," he said gruffly, "I'll admit, I wasn't too thrilled about this at first. But if you're serious about giving this guy a chance, then, well, I guess I can stand to let him have another bowl of soup." Laura smiled, and Tom's eyes widened with gratitude. "Thank you, John," Laura said warmly. "That means a lot." John grunted, but a hint of a smile tugged at his mouth. Yeah, he muttered, turning back to the kitchen. "Just don't make me regret it." Tom watched him go, his heart feeling lighter than it had in months. He turned to Laura, a new sense of determination in his eyes. "I'll be there tomorrow," he promised. 9 o'clock sharp. Laura nodded, pleased. "I'm looking forward to it," she said. Remember, one step at a time. Tom nodded again, holding Lily a little closer. One step at a time, he repeated, and for the first time in a long while, he believed it. The next morning, a hint of sunshine peeked through the gray clouds that had lingered over the city for days. Soft beams of light reflected off the damp streets, casting an almost ethereal glow over the sidewalks. The air felt crisp and fresh, carrying the promise of a new beginning. Inside John's diner, the usual morning crowd had begun to trickle in. Truck drivers rubbed sleep from their eyes as they sat down for a hot breakfast, college students huddled over textbooks, and the regulars took their usual seats, greeting Sophie with smiles and nods. The low hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and the familiar hiss of the coffee machine. John moved behind the counter with his characteristic efficiency, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He found himself glancing at the door more often than usual. Despite his initial reservations, he hoped to see Tom return. Beneath his gruff exterior, he felt a small flicker of curiosity, and maybe even a little hope. Sophie, moving between tables with her usual bright energy, also kept an eye on the entrance. Something about the events of the previous day had left an impression on her. It was as if watching Laura stand up for Tom had ignited a spark within her, a quiet inspiration she hadn't anticipated. At exactly 8:55, the door swung open, and there he was, Tom, holding Lily in his arms. He looked different today. His clothes were still worn but noticeably cleaner, and he had tried to tidy himself up. His hair was brushed back, and his eyes held a hint of determination. As he stepped inside, the murmur of the diner quieted for a moment, and all eyes seemed to turn his way, silently assessing whether he would live up to the chance he'd been given. Laura was already seated in their usual booth by the window. As soon as she spotted Tom, she waved him over with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Tom," she called warmly. "Right on time." Tom returned her smile, visibly relieved to see a familiar face. "Morning," he replied, his voice more confident than the day before. He shifted Lily in his arms, and the baby let out a small coo, her tiny hands reaching toward the light streaming in from the window. Laura leaned forward, her smile widening as she looked at Lily. "And good morning to you, too, little one," she said with a grin. "Looks like someone's enjoying the sunshine." Tom slid into the booth across from Laura, carefully settling Lily on his lap. "She is," he agreed, a soft smile touching his lips. "It's nice to see the sun again." Laura nodded. "A good sign," she said. "A good day for new beginnings." Tom's smile grew slightly. "I hope so," he said. "I'm ready to get started." Before Laura could respond, Sophie appeared at their table with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a small plate of scrambled eggs. "Thought you might need a little energy boost," she said with a cheerful smile. "On the house." Tom looked up, surprised by yet another gesture of kindness. "Thank you," he said softly, clearly moved. "I really appreciate it." Sophie shrugged lightly, still smiling. "Just make today count," she replied. "That's all the thanks I need." Tom nodded, grateful, and Sophie gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder before returning to the counter. Laura took a sip of her coffee, then set the cup down, her expression turning serious. "All right, Tom," she began, "I'm going to be honest with you. The work at my agency isn't glamorous, and it's not easy. We're a small team, and everyone wears a lot of hats. But if you're willing to put in the effort, I think you might find it rewarding." Tom nodded. "I'm not afraid of hard work," he said quietly. "I've done all kinds of jobs, whatever it took to get by." Laura studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. That's exactly the attitude I'm looking for." She glanced down at Lily, who was now staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. "And don't worry about Lily," she added. "We'll figure something out. I know a few people who might be able to help with daycare or some kind of arrangement until you're back on your feet." Tom's expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Laura," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't, stepped in yesterday." Laura waved it off. "You don't have to thank me, Tom," she said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes, we just need a little help getting back on the right track." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the bell above the door. An older man, Mike, who had been sitting quietly at the counter, turned around. He was a regular at John's, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Mike had been watching Tom since he entered, his keen eyes following every movement. He stood up, cleared his throat, and made his way over to the booth. "Excuse me," he began, his voice a bit raspy but kind. "I couldn't help overhearing yesterday. You're looking for a job?" Tom nodded, surprised by the direct approach. "Yes, sir, I am," he replied, unsure of where this was heading. Mike nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I've got a small grocery store down the street. Been there for 40 years. We're not hiring right now, but I know most folks around here. If you need someone to vouch for you, once you've got a steady thing going, I'd be glad to put in a good word." Tom blinked, taken aback. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You'd do that for me?" Mike nodded again, his face serious but kind. "Everyone deserves a shot," he said simply. "Especially when they've got a little one depending on them." Tom swallowed hard, emotion welling up in his chest. "Thank you," he managed to say. I really appreciate it." Mike smiled briefly, then turned and headed back to his seat at the counter, leaving Tom stunned and a bit overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness he was receiving. Laura watched the exchange with a pleased expression. "See," she said softly, leaning closer. "Kindness has a way of spreading, Tom. You just needed that first push, and now look, people want to help you." Tom nodded, still processing everything. "I guess I never realized how much people care," he admitted quietly. "I've been so used to being invisible, it's strange to be seen." Laura reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Well, you're not invisible anymore," she said firmly. "Not here." The morning flowed on, filled with small, kind gestures. A couple of customers left a few extra dollars with Sophie, asking her to give them to Tom. Another woman who had been reading a book by the window offered a few baby clothes she had in her car, remnants from her own child's early years. Tom's eyes grew moist with each gesture, each unexpected act of goodwill. As the hours passed, Tom felt something begin to change inside him. A warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, even if just for a moment. He was still nervous about the job, still worried about what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had a fighting chance. By the time they left the diner, Tom was carrying a small bag filled with donated items, his heart fuller than it had been in a long time. As they stepped out into the bright morning sun, he turned to Laura. "I don't know how to repay all of this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I've been given more than I could ever give back." Laura smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just pay it forward someday," she said simply. "When you're in a position to help someone else, remember how this feels, and do the same. That's how it works, Tom. One step at a time." Tom nodded, holding Lily a little tighter. "I will," he promised. "I swear I will." And as they walked down the street, toward the next chapter of Tom's life, the sun continued to rise, burning away the last remnants of the morning mist. Tom stood outside the building where Laura's small marketing agency was located. The modest sign above the door read, "Bright Ideas Marketing," and the large windows on either side displayed a few colorful posters and flyers for local businesses. His nerves danced in his chest as he shifted Lily on his hip. The previous night had been a restless one, filled with thoughts of what lay ahead, a swirl of hope and fear that made sleep elusive. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. "All right, Lily," he murmured softly, looking down at his daughter. "Let's go see what happens." As he opened the door, a small bell chimed above, announcing their arrival. The inside of the office was bright and welcoming, with sunlight streaming through the windows, casting soft, warm light over the desks arranged in an open layout. Each desk was cluttered with papers, marketing materials, and computers, while plants in the corners added a touch of green to the otherwise simple decor. Laura was already there, seated at a desk near the back. She looked up as Tom entered and immediately smiled. "Hey, Tom." "Right on time," she called out, waving him over. Tom felt a rush of relief wash over him at the sight of her friendly face. He navigated around a few stray chairs and stacks of paper. "Morning," he greeted, his voice tentative but polite. I hope it's okay that I brought Lily with me. I didn't have anyone to watch her." Laura stood up and nodded reassuringly. "Of course, it's fine," she said. "We'll make it work. Come on, let me introduce you to the team." She led Tom over to the first desk, where a young man with glasses and a neatly trimmed beard was typing furiously on a keyboard. "This is Mark," Laura introduced. "He's our graphic designer and social media expert. Mark, this is Tom." Mark glanced up and gave a friendly nod. "Nice to meet you, Tom," he said with a quick smile before returning to his screen. "Sorry, just finishing up a post. I'll catch up in a second." Next, Laura pointed to a woman with curly red hair, who was sifting through a stack of papers with an intense expression. "And that's Rebecca," she continued. "She's our account manager. Keeps us all on track and makes sure the clients are happy." Rebecca looked up, her expression softening into a warm smile. "Hey there, Tom," she said. "Glad to have you with us. Don't mind the mess, I'm just trying to find a contract I swear I saw 5 minutes ago." Tom chuckled, feeling a little more at ease. "I've seen worse," he replied, which made Rebecca laugh. Laura moved them along to a small desk near the back, where an older man with salt and pepper hair was on the phone, speaking in a low, measured tone. "That's David," Laura whispered. "He's our copywriter and the office dad. You'll like him, he's a good guy." Tom nodded, taking in the lively, bustling atmosphere. The office was small but filled with the kind of energy that made him feel like he could belong. There was a sense of camaraderie here, a shared purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. Laura guided him back to her desk, where she pulled up a chair for him. "Okay, let's get started," she said. "I want to give you some basic tasks today, just to see where your skills are and how you handle things. Nothing too complicated, mostly bookkeeping work and organizing a few client files." Tom nodded, trying to steady his nerves. "I can do that," he said, feeling a spark of confidence. Laura smiled. "I'm sure you can. And if you have any questions, just ask. We're all here to help each other." Tom took a seat and began looking through the files Laura handed him. The work was familiar, comforting in a way. Numbers had always made sense to him, they were predictable, logical, a stark contrast to the chaos his life had become. As he worked, he found himself settling into a rhythm, his hands moving steadily over the keyboard, his mind focused and clear. Meanwhile, Lily babbled happily from a makeshift playpen Laura had set up with pillows and a blanket in the corner of her office. Laura glanced over from time to time, smiling at the sight of the little girl's curiosity as she reached for a colorful rattle or watched the others move around. After a few hours, Laura came back to check on him. "How's it going?" she asked, leaning against the desk. Tom looked up, surprised by how quickly the time had passed. "Good," he replied. "I think I'm getting the hang of things." Laura nodded. "That's great to hear," she said. "I knew you'd pick it up fast." As the morning wore on, the office buzzed with more activity. Rebecca found her missing contract and was on the phone negotiating with a client. Mark was brainstorming new social media strategies, occasionally throwing out ideas for feedback. David, the copywriter, scribbled notes on a legal pad, muttering softly as he tried to get the wording just right for a campaign. Tom glanced around, feeling a pleasant sensation, like he was part of something again. He wasn't just existing, he was contributing, and it felt good. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt like he had a place. During a break, Laura sat down across from Tom with a cup of coffee. "I wanted to ask you," she began, "what made you decide to take that first step into the diner yesterday? I mean, I'm glad you did, but what brought you there?" Tom thought for a moment, considering her question. "Honestly," he replied slowly, "I didn't know where else to go. I was desperate, and I figured, maybe someone might help. Or at least not throw me out right away." Laura nodded, understanding. "I'm glad you chose John's," she said with a smile. "It's strange, isn't it? How a single moment, a single decision, can change everything?" Tom nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "Yeah," he agreed. "It's strange, but good. I feel like, maybe this is the start of something better." Laura smiled warmly. "I think so too," she said. "And I'm glad you're here, Tom. I really am." Just then, Mark called out from his desk. "Hey, Tom," he shouted, holding up a stack of papers. "Think you could help me sort through these invoices? I'm terrible with numbers." Tom laughed, feeling a sense of ease he hadn't felt in months. "Sure thing," he replied, getting up to join him. "Let's see what we've got." The day continued like this: small tasks, shared conversations, and the slow building of trust. By the time the afternoon sun started dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the office floor, Tom felt a tiredness different from the exhaustion of the streets. This was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from honest work and a sense of purpose. As he packed up to leave, Laura handed him an envelope. "It's not much," she said, almost apologetically, "just a little something to get you started. And you did great today, Tom. I'm looking forward to seeing what more you can do." Tom took the envelope, his throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you, Laura," he said quietly. "For everything." Laura smiled. "Just keep showing up, Tom. That's all I ask." Tom nodded, holding Lily close as he stepped out of the office and into the cool evening air. He glanced back at the building one last time, his heart full. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. He turned, feeling the weight of the world lift just a little from his shoulders, and began to walk, the city lights guiding his path forward. Tom's days at Bright Ideas Marketing quickly fell into a steady rhythm. He would arrive each morning with Lily in tow, sometimes a few minutes early, sometimes just on time, but always ready to work. The team welcomed him with open arms, and he found himself fitting in more comfortably than he'd expected. Each day brought new tasks, challenges, and small victories that slowly rebuilt his confidence. By the end of the first week, Tom was handling the company's accounts with ease. He had proven himself to be organized, efficient, and good with numbers, skills that had gone unnoticed and unused for far too long. His presence lightened the load on everyone else, allowing them to focus more on the creative work that drove the agency forward. The team seemed to be thriving, and Tom felt a quiet pride in knowing he was contributing to something meaningful. Lily had become a familiar fixture in the office as well. The staff quickly grew fond of her, taking turns to watch over her while Tom worked. Rebecca often brought small toys and books from home, and David, with his gentle manner, would soothe her to sleep with a soft lullaby or a story he made up on the spot. Even Mark, always a bit awkward with kids, found himself laughing as Lily grabbed at his nose or pulled at his glasses. One afternoon, a couple of weeks into his new routine, Laura approached Tom's desk with a thoughtful expression. "Tom, do you have a minute?" she asked. Tom looked up from his work, sensing something serious in her tone. "Of course," he replied, setting down his pen. "What's up?" Laura glanced around to make sure no one was listening in, then pulled a chair over and sat down next to him. "I've been thinking," she began, choosing her words carefully, "about your situation. You've been doing such a great job here, and I can see how much it means to you to make a fresh start." Tom nodded, unsure where she was going with this, but feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. He hoped she wasn't about to tell him that his time at the agency was over, that they couldn't afford to keep him any longer. Laura continued, noticing the tension in his expression. "I don't want you to worry," she said quickly. "You're doing great, and we're happy to have you. But I was thinking, maybe it's time to start planning for the next step." Tom's brow furrowed. "The next step," he repeated, a mix of confusion and curiosity in his voice. Laura nodded. "Yes," she said. "You've proven yourself to be reliable and hardworking, Tom. And I know you want to provide a stable life for Lily. I've been talking to a few contacts I have, and there might be a position opening up at one of our client companies, an accounting job, full-time. It would pay more than what I can offer, and it would come with benefits. It could be exactly what you need to get back on your feet." Tom felt his heart quicken, a wave of emotions crashing over him. Are you serious?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. Laura smiled warmly. "Very serious," she replied. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think you were ready. But it's up to you, of course. I just wanted you to know that I believe in you, Tom. You've come so far already, and I think you're ready for this." Tom sat back, taking a deep breath as he processed her words. It was everything he had hoped for, a chance at a real, stable job, something that could truly change his and Lily's life. And yet, a part of him hesitated. He had grown attached to this small office, to the people who had welcomed him so openly. He had found a kind of family here, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. "But I don't want to leave you guys," he confessed, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I feel like I'm just starting to find my place here." Laura nodded, understanding. "I get that," she said gently. "And believe me, we would miss having you around. But this is about more than just a job, Tom. It's about your future, about giving Lily the life she deserves. And you'll always have a place with us, no matter what you decide." Tom took a moment to let her words sink in. He glanced over at Lily, who was giggling as Mark made silly faces at her. His heart swelled with love and determination. He knew Laura was right. This was a chance he couldn't pass up, not if he wanted to build something real, something lasting, for himself and his daughter. I think I'd like to try," he finally said, a mixture of fear and excitement in his voice. "I'm nervous, but I think you're right. I have to at least give it a shot." Laura beamed at him, her eyes bright with encouragement. "That's the spirit," she said. "I'll make a few calls and set up an interview for you. Just be yourself, Tom. That's all you need to do." Tom nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. "Thank you, Laura," he said earnestly. "For everything. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Laura reached over and gave his hand a comforting squeeze. "You don't have to repay me," she replied softly. "Just keep moving forward. That's all the thanks I need." A week later, Tom found himself sitting in a brightly lit office, waiting for his interview to begin. The receptionist had offered him a cup of coffee, but his hands were too shaky to hold it. He kept thinking about Lily, about the future, and about all the people who had helped him get here. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. When the door finally opened, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit stepped out, extending his hand with a smile. "Tom, nice to meet you," he said warmly. "I'm James, the head of HR here. Come on in, let's have a chat." Tom stood up, shaking James's hand with a firm grip. "Nice to meet you, too," he replied, doing his best to keep his voice steady. The interview went better than he expected. James asked about his experience, and Tom spoke confidently about his time at Bright Ideas, his background in accounting, and the struggles he'd faced. He was honest about the gaps in his employment and the challenges he'd overcome. By the end of the meeting, James seemed genuinely impressed. "You've got a lot of resilience, Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I like that. And your experience is exactly what we're looking for. I think you'd be a great fit here." Tom felt a surge of hope. "Really?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. James nodded. "Really," he confirmed. I'll need to run this by my team, of course, but I'm confident we can make this work. I'll be in touch soon. Tom thanked him profusely, shaking his hand again before leaving the office. As he stepped outside into the cool air, he felt a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. He had done it, he had taken that next step. When he returned to Bright Ideas later that day, the entire team was waiting for him, their faces filled with anticipation. "How did it go?" Mark asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Tom grinned, feeling a rare swell of confidence. "I think it went well," he said. "Really well." The room erupted into cheers, and even Lily, sensing the joyful energy around her, let out a delighted squeal. Laura stepped forward, her smile wide and proud. "I knew you could do it, Tom," she said, pulling him into a brief, warm hug. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt truly at peace. He looked around at the faces of his new friends, his new family, and realized that this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but he knew now that he didn't have to walk it alone. And as he held Lily close, watching her smile and laugh, he knew in his heart that everything was going to be okay. Life had thrown him a lifeline when he needed it most, and now it was his turn to keep moving forward, to embrace the chance he'd been given, and to create the kind of life he'd always dreamed of, for himself and for his daughter. With a deep breath, Tom smiled and whispered softly to Lily, "One step at a time, sweetheart. One step at a time."